Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 20. And here today we begin a couple of lectures examining the interwar period. I know I've already spoiled it. I've revealed to all of you that in this class, not only do you get one world war, you get two world wars. And so the period we talk about here today and in our next lecture is known as the interwar period because it's in between World War I and World War II. To put this in another way, we're talking about the 1920s and the 1930s. And we'll begin our look at the interwar period with a look at a major global depression that will rock the global economy and set in motion a number of events that will lead to World War II. I know so far this class has just been, fun and games, right? We've had imperialism, we've had a ruinous war, a global pandemic. Well, enough with all that fun stuff. Let's now introduce the Great Depression. We begin our look at the interwar period and the Great Depression with the Russian Revolution as now aftermath. As we examined in our most recent lecture, the largest country on earth through the course of World War I, at the end of that conflict, would be transformed to the very first communist state in human history. And so now it's out there. It's out there as a model of another way to organize society. One of the great debates, one of the great questions we examine in this history of the 20th century is this question of how best to organize society. What is the best way to engender progress? And now, with the success of the Russian Revolution, with the Bolsheviks now in charge of the largest country on earth, with the fall of a monarchy, the Romanov dynasty that had controlled Russia for centuries, what had once been a theory, an argument of Marx, Engels, and others, was now reality. It was no longer theoretical, a debate, an argument, an idea in contrast to liberalism and liberal democracies. Now, with the Russian Revolution, there was a model, a template out there for transitioning to a communist state. And Marx, Engels, Lenin, thus influenced by Marx and Engels, believed again in this linear logic, this linear flow of history, that things move in a certain direction, that there's a certain linear logic to human events. Just as we went from feudalism to capitalism, we could now go on to communism. Also, in this way of thinking is a broad sweep of human history that folds everyone in, that this is a forward march, an inevitable march. And so the true believers, those who were strong adherents to this way of thinking, saw in the Russian Revolution the first step of that forward motion, and that like a contagion, this would spread around the globe. Now, for those who warmly embrace socialism, communism, those who agreed with the critiques of capitalism voiced by Lenin, Marx, and others welcome that. But if you're a capitalist, if you're industrialist, if you are that class of people who have come to control such societies, well, you fear that contagion. And that explains a lot of what happened in the aftermath of World War I and the Russian Revolution in the early interwar period in industrialized nations, where there was this great fear that if it could happen there, it could happen here. Many people who were critics of communism still feared its logic argument, its logic of a linear transformation, the idea of it as a contagion enveloping the world. Workers of the world, unite and take over. And if it could happen in Russia, there were great fears that it could happen in Germany and France and Great Britain, in the United States, in those nations that did have stark disparities between haves and have-nots. And that led to repression in many of these nations that feared that they might be next, that what began in Russia could not be turned back, that it could envelop the next industrial nation. Here in the United States, it led to the first Red Scare. Now, later in the class, we'll talk about the second Red Scare that took place here in the United States in the early Cold War period. That's the war after World War II. There's just one war after another in this class. And you're probably familiar somewhat with that second Red Scare, Richard Nixon, Joseph McCarthy, blacklisting in Hollywood. But the first Red Scare took place in the 1920s, in this moment that we're examining here today, in the aftermath of World War I and the Russian Revolution, where there was this fear that what happened in Russia could happen here in the United States. It led to repression against political dissidents. There was a socialist movement in the United States in the 1920s, and it was targeted by the government, by police forces, great repression against labor unions, which were associated with critiques of capitalism, critiques of the excesses of capitalism in an industrial economy. And a lot of labor unions were stamped out, driven underground in the 1920s. The Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer, ordered raids on labor unions, on political groups, many of which had no ties to socialism or communism, but were seen as critics of the existing order. Many of them were civil rights organizations that were critical of things like segregation, discrimination, lynching. A. Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General, the highest law enforcement officer here in the United States, ordered a series of raids on those organizations, including civil rights organizations, to try to find information that would associate the leaders, the movements, with a communist uprising. So he went looking for evidence, and this was an open violation of constitutional protections against unlawful searches and seizures. But if you study American history, you notice that time and time again, rights that we imagined are forever protected, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, protection from unlawful searches and seizures, well, those rights are often trampled upon. In the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, rounded up thousands of people, threw them in jail, simply because they were critics of Lincoln's effort in the war. In the 1920s, you have the Palmer raids. In World War II, there's the internment of Japanese Americans. There is the repression of the second Red Scare in the McCarthy-Nixon era. So time and time again, we Americans have seen rights that we imagine to be protected taken away, and today we live in the age of wireless wiretapping, the Patriot Act. Have you been to the airport recently? Well, no, you haven't been to the airport recently because you can't travel anywhere, but you vaguely remember going through those security lines where they grabbed you here, grabbed you there. Yeah, so much for unlawful searches and seizures. You walk through this machine that takes a picture of you naked now just so that you can get an $89 flight on Southwest, right? Yeah. So much for protection against unlawful searches and seizures. What happened in the Palmer raids is part of this moment, part of the 1920s, part of this fear of repression or fear of a communist revolution in the United States that led to this repression. But the Palmer raids are not unique. They're a good example of how, time and time again, we Americans have often lost our rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, protection from unlawful searches and seizures. There was a wave of repression here in the United States in the 1920s in an overall conservative and reactionary period. And the group that was most targeted in this fear of a communist overthrow within the United States, immigrants. In 1924, the United States passed, for the very first time, large-scale immigration restrictions. Prior to 1924, anyone who wanted to come to the United States could come, and if you were white, you could become a citizen. In the 19th century, when America was industrializing, when it was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution, immigrants from around the world poured into this country. And you could because there were very few of any restrictions. It was a time of open borders. But in 1924, the United States established large-scale immigration restrictions targeting immigrants, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, areas that were associated with radicalism, communism. And so you had this effort to cut off immigration from most of the world in the 1920s with the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. The United States was not alone. Most of the industrialized nations of the world, now in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, in the aftermath of World War I, when there was so much trauma and consequence to that conflict, those nations veered in a very conservative, reactionary, rightward way, including the United States and France, which saw to its parliament a number of conservative, reactionary figures winning great political power overall within France and most of the industrialized nations of the world, a propaganda campaign that targeted people who were seen to be unpatriotic or fomenters of dissent, those who were critical, and there was a lot to say in criticism of the nation state, its handling of World War I and its aftermath, but this conservative ethic prevailed, and it led to, again, a lot of repression, a lot of targeting of individuals because France, United States, and many nations in the aftermath of World War I and the Russian Revolution feared that in a time of scarcity, as these economies were ravaged by World War I and its consequences, that the ethos and spirit of communism, which calls for redistribution of wealth, which offered to the people of these nations bread, peace, and land, yeah, that wasn't just appealing to poor Russian peasants. There were a lot of people in industrialized nations who wanted bread, peace, and land even after World War I. And so in that time of acute economic deprivation, in a time of crisis, in a time where, again, a pandemic was still sweeping through much of the world, there was this concern that in that context, the message of communism would find broad appeal. And that led to this reactionary conservative response that sought to suppress dissent and really shore up state powers in an effort to prevent what happened in Russia happening in other nations of the world. So this is a point I made in our recent lecture on the Russian Revolution. Now it's out there, a model, not just of a different way of governing society, but achieving that through first bloody revolution. And that led to, again, a lot of fear among power brokers in industrial parts of the world like France and the United States. Let's deepen this look at the conservative turn in many of these industrialized nations in the 1920s, during that period of repression against what we're seeing as revolutionary elements within. In 1920, here in the United States, Warren G. Harding ran for president. Warren G. Harding ran in 1920, seeking to reclaim the White House for the Republican Party. Warren G. Harding was a Republican, and the Democrats had controlled the White House since Woodrow Wilson's election in 1912. We talked a lot about Woodrow Wilson in our recent lectures on World War I. He was president for 8 years. He was a Democrat, and the Republicans wanted to win back the White House in 1920, now in the aftermath of World War I. And so in 1920, the Republicans nominated Warren G. Harding, the original Warren G., but he wasn't much of a regulator, this Warren G. However, he had the perfect word, the perfect term to appeal to Americans when he ran for president in 1920. He said, "Elect me, and I will return the nation to, quote, normalcy." He sort of coined that word rather than normality. He coined a neologism of normalcy. But despite the grammatical problems with the term, it was the perfect appeal because Americans had lived through the tumult of World War I, which did a great deal of, brought a great deal of change to the United States. We talked about the CPI, Committee on Public Information, as a case study of propaganda used in World War I. That's one example of the domestic impact of World War I on the United States, but also during that period, not only did you have the government and the propaganda business, you had the Great Migration, which we talked a little bit about, a major demographic shift, the race riots that followed. At the end of World War I, white women secured the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So now African Americans are moving to northern cities. Now women are voting. For many Americans, this was a period of unsettling change, and they craved normalcy. Wouldn't it be great if we could just go back to when things were normal? Not only had the United States lived through the tumult of World War I, but they had also lived through a dramatic change that began with the Spanish-American War, an event we talked about earlier in the class, where for 20 years America had marched around the globe, fought wars, taken colonies. That led to ruinous wars like the U.S.-Philippine War, World War I. There was, again, a major pandemic sweeping through the nation. So, wouldn't it be nice if we could just go back to normalcy? What did Americans want in 1920? We want to be like Dorothy and click our heels together and go doodaloo, doodaloo, doodaloo back before all this madness began. Also complementing that was that spirit of a lost utopia which spanned all the nations involved in World War I. That sense that the hope and prospects of this new century that began with such hope and promise, a new age of skyscrapers and automobiles, turned out to be a lie. that we had placed our faith in science, reason, rationality, and technology, and World War I shattered that faith when it clearly demonstrated how technology doesn't lead to a better world. Technology does not lead to prospects for a better outcome for humanity. I know it's very tempting to draw parallels between 2020 here and 1920, right? Here's a presidential candidate running saying, I'll make things normal again, and increasing suspicion about technology and whether or not it actually makes for a better life. Well, draw the parallels if you may. That certainly was the appeal here in the United States with Warren G. Harding's candidacy. And he would win in 1920 and be the first of a series of Republican presidents who would turn the nation in a more conservative direction, leading to things like the Johnston-Reed Act of 1924 that cut off immigration from most of the world. But it's not just the United States that's seeing this rise of conservatism. You can also see it in Germany, in Hungary, as it emerged as an independent nation coming out of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. In Great Britain, members of the Tory party were elected to parliament. So overall, the nations that were stung by the miseries, deprivations of World War I, the nations that experienced the horrors of this conflict and therefore were in the grips of this idea of a lost utopia, well, in those nations, they veered in a very conservative, reactionary way in the hopes of not only returning to normalcy, but also, of course, as we said earlier, staving off what was seen as a potential revolution, an overthrow of their nation, the existing order as exemplified by the Russian Revolution. Bolstering this idea of a return to normalcy or the virtues of returning to a more conservative ethic after dramatic change in the early 20th century was the way in which the economies of these industrial nations rebounded by the mid-1920s and seemingly helped to restore prosperity to the nations that were ravaged by World War I, the immediate aftermath, the pandemic. By the mid-1920s, the United States and Great Britain, their economies had returned to pre-war production. And with it came a sense that, well, yeah, it was pretty scary what happened in Russia, but it's Russia. It's way over there, and they're different than us, and it couldn't happen here. A certain confidence sort of returned to many of the industrialized nations. It seemed like normalcy had returned. By 1928, unemployment had dropped to just 3% in the United States. Henry Ford was mass producing Model T cars. They were sold for $220, so that even the poor dirt farmer way off in Speed Bump, Kansas, or the poor industrial worker in urban areas could afford the pleasure and comforts of an automobile, maybe buy a radio, and have the miracle of wireless entertainment emanating into your home. And all this seemed to restore faith in industrialization, capitalism, serve as a bulwark against potential communist overthrows. There's no need for a revolution here because, again, the economy is strong. But that veil of prosperity was a false one. That prosperity was really built on debt, borrowing, speculation. Here in the United States, people are borrowing money to buy automobiles and suburban homes, the first wave of suburbanization in the 1920s, confident they'd be able to pay off those loans over time. But also people are borrowing money to invest in stock, speculating in that way, overheating the New York Stock Exchange, a lot of speculation in real estate. There were efforts to remedy a lot of the effects of World War I that led to deregulation of many banking and finance industries in industrial nations, and that led to speculation. It was really all built on, again, a glass shelf. It was all an overheated false economy where there really wasn't anything substantive behind it. And so the mid to late 20s brought a return to prosperity, seeming prosperity, in many of these nations. And with it, there was this hope that we could put to bed, put in the distance the ravages of World War I. excuse the Russian Revolution as an anomaly, something that happened there that could not happen here, and re-embrace the prospects of a new technological, scientific age, now most manifest in consumer goods, things like motion pictures, automobiles, radios. See those as emblems of a reclaim, not just normalcy, but opportunity and prosperity. But this was short-lived because what was fueling all of this economic rebound was, again, a great deal of speculation, leveraging, borrowing, and eventually that would lead to the event that is our focus in this lecture, a global depression with key consequences to follow. Here in the United States, that depression would begin soon after the stock market crash in October of 1929. Now, the stock market crash in and of itself does not cause the Great Depression. Instead, it was symptomatic of broader currents and trends underneath the American economy, more reflective rather than causal in this case, but it certainly aggrandized and amplified the fears and concerns, and it led to some consequences that only deepened the economic woes and miseries that were, again, deep below the surface in the industrialized world. Here in the United States, the nadir, the low point of the Great Depression, occurred in the years between 1929 and 1932. In 1932 alone, 1 in 4 Americans completely out of work. The gross national product, the collective value of all goods, services produced, fell by 33%. You had massive deflation, huge drops, declines in the price of consumer goods. You might say, oh, that's great, everything's cheaper. No, massive deflation is just as bad as massive inflation, a rise in prices. Massive deflation means that producers are going to be less likely to produce goods because they have to charge less and less for them. Eventually, it's not going to make sense for them to produce a phonograph or icebox, and they close their factory and lay off their workforce, which now, therefore, doesn't have the means to buy other consumer goods. Like ripples in a pond, the economic woe and misery reached far, amplifying again and deepening trends. It's like an evil snowball rolling downhill here. And so what began with speculation, borrowing, with a stock market crash, with unemployment, you just had this spiraling of misery. And again, it's sort of a 180. We went from the booming, roaring economy of the 1920s that for many Americans restored their faith in capitalism, industrialization, to this now, the worst economic disaster in our history. People who lost their homes, people who were evicted from their apartments, found themselves living in shanty towns, living in communities they dubbed Hoovervilles. Now, Herbert Hoover was the President of the United States when the Great Depression begins. He was a rich businessman and ran in 1928 with that reputation. I know it's strange to imagine that the American people would elect a guy because he was a rich businessman. Again, use your historical imagination to imagine such a strange and different time. Herbert Hoover was the last of a string of Republican presidents, 1920, starting with our old friend Mr. Normalcy, Warren G. Harding, continuing through Calvin Coolidge, and then finally Herbert Hoover, who, after being sworn in early 1929 in his inaugural address, said, quote, "Our future is bright with hope." And then a few months later, the stock market crashes and the country descends into this great global disaster, the Great Depression. So he had egg on his face. He looked like a fool. And as a result, when people lost their homes, when they were evicted from their apartments and were living in these shanty towns, they blamed Herbert Hoover. He was the guy in charge when everything went to hell. And that's why they dubbed these communities Hoovervilles. Hoovervilles were shanty towns. They were communities of people who created these homes from spare lumber, spare aluminum, without heat, without electricity, without running water, in the heart of industrial capitalism, in the heart of the new industrial age. And again, the aftermath of years in the 1920s where there was this restorative hope in capitalism, industrialization. Now people were living in shanty towns dubbed Hoovervilles. Bread lines snake through American cities as people huddled together desperate for food. Again, use your historical imagination to imagine such a time in the United States where people had to wait in long lines just to get bare sustenance, to get food. This reverses industrialization and urbanization because people fled cities in the Great Depression here in the United States. It reversed a 100-year trend. Remember, we talked about industrialization, urbanization as twin dynamics in the 1800s, the 19th century, as America rapidly industrialized. People left the farm. They went to cities to work in factories. Well, now, in the Great Depression, factories were closed. There were no opportunities in cities, and people moved back to rural areas, reasoning, well, at least I might be able to find some land and farm crops and be able to feed my family. The Great Depression was so concussive in its impact, it reversed a century-long trend in the United States of urbanization, of people leaving rural areas and going to farm and going to cities. Instead now, with factories closed, with the only thing awaiting you in a city being a breadline or Hooverville, people return to rural areas. That concussive impact truly speaking to the debilitating impact of this economic disaster. People in the United States in the 1930s lived a rootless, itinerant existence, traveling in vain quite often around the country looking for work. If you're familiar with the novels of John Steinbeck, novels like The Grapes of Wrath, you are somewhat familiar with this historical phenomenon where people traveled the country looking for work. As a result, an entire generation of Americans came of age without a sense of home, without a sense of permanency and place. This was, again, particularly abusive because just a few years earlier, it looked like our nation and its future was bright with hope. When Herbert Hoover says that in early 1929, most Americans say, yeah, he's right. Our future is bright with hope. And then a few months later, stock market crashes. And so this was particularly debilitating because it seemed to indicate the American dream had turned out to be a lie. As people traveled around the country, growing up without a sense of permanency, without a sense of home, seeking employment often in vain. Many of the workers who came out to California, as dramatized by John Steinbeck in novels like The Grapes of Wrath, found very little work here in California. They found that those hopes and prospects for employment were ultimately a lie, and this only deepened their disillusionment, their despair, their sense of America and the industrial economy staring into the abyss. All the measurements of hope for the future decline. All the measurements of pessimism increase. The marriage and birth rate plummeted because people could not imagine a future where they'd be able to raise a family, buy a home. They would never live as their parents and grandparents had. All the measurements of pessimism increasing, including the highest suicide rate in American history. Now, you may have heard tales of rich businessmen who killed themselves in the Great Depression because they were guilty of malfeasance and illegality. Part of what led to the Great Depression and the stock market crash was the way in which a deregulated banking and finance industry, not just in the United States, but in much of the industrial world, allowed certain businessmen to speculate and engage in illegality, malfeasance without regulation, without oversight, boards in place. And some of those businessmen, fearing going to prison because of their illegality, killed themselves. But those stories are rare. The majority of Americans who killed themselves in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, during the highest suicide rate in American history, were not rich businessmen who feared going to prison. They were ordinary workers, ordinary laborers, who internalized a sense of shame, blaming themselves for something that wasn't their fault. Internalized a sense of shame because they could no longer pay the rent, feed their family. And so some of them took this drastic step of killing themselves. There were spikes in infant mortality, children not living to their second birthday. Starvation, deprivation, very real. Again, in the heart of industrial global capitalism, the United States, in a nation that just a few years prior did glimmer with hope as the post-war economy boom rippled through the 1920s. But again, that boom was a false boom. And now, in this very different reality, Americans felt this acute sense of despair, misery. We returned to, in many ways, a sense of disillusionment, that sense of a lost utopia that began in the 1920s to a limited extent was quelled, silenced by the rebounding economy, By the mid-1920s, you could afford a car, go to a movie palace and see a motion picture. By the late 20s with sound. And as a result, Americans came to believe, once again, in industrial capitalism. They came to believe that all is right in America. They elected a rich businessman, President of the United States, and then another 180. Boom! Stock market crashes, Great Depression. And here in the United States, this led to a rebounded fear as a result in radicalism. That in this sense of disillusionment and despair, perhaps what took place in Russia could take place here. We'll talk more about that soon in our look at the responses to the Great Depression. Here are a couple of images from the Great Depression here in the United States to complement the description I offered on the previous slide. On the left, that's Hooverville. That's what they look like. And so you can see what was taking place in the heart of industrial capitalism. Here were Americans now living in shantytowns. And again, they dubbed them Hoovervilles as a way of blaming the guy in charge, Herbert Hoover, for their now economic misery and woe. Herbert Hoover was often seen as indifferent to the suffering of Americans. He was seen as callous and unresponsive, and so that again accounts for the term used here, Hoovervilles. And this photograph is particularly helpful because not only does it allow you to see a Hooverville, to see what was taking place in the United States in the early 1930s, but it's a very telling photograph because you could see in the background the factories that once employed these people, now shuttered closed in this Great Depression. So this photograph tells the story in many ways of what was taking place in the United States in the early 1930s. On the right, a breadline. Here are men huddled together, desperate for bread, for bare sustenance for their families. And this photograph is taken in Times Square, in the heart of the global industrial economy, in the heart of urban America, in the heart of the global finance and banking center of the world, New York City. There in Times Square are these men huddled together looking for a loaf of bread to feed themselves and their families. That's what took place in this country during the 1930s. Let's talk about the impact of the Depression in other parts of the industrialized global economy in Europe, where you see a very similar dynamic. Factories close, lay off their workforce now has no income, cannot purchase consumer goods, and so you see a cut in production, a cut in employment, world trade cut in half, so 50% decline in the number of industrial goods circulating through the global economy. We have spent some time in our first few lectures here examining this process of industrialization, where in certain parts of the world you have this transformation to an industrial economy predicated on people and factories mass producing goods, selling those goods to distant markets. Well, there wasn't a market for those goods, and so production declines, and as a result those laborers are laid off and they face these very dire straits, these dire conditions. Banking and finance industries collapse in Austria, one of those new nations formed in the aftermath of World War I. Their banking system fails in 1931. This interconnected global economy centered on industrialization, manufacturing, credit, capital, all of it was tightly connected. And so when you get the United States dragged into the Great Depression, well, it drags all of these nations along with it. Great Britain was already deep in debt from World War I, and so the role it could have played as a bulwark against the Great Depression, loaning out money to other European nations, it was unwilling to do because it already had this mammoth debt from World War I. It's one of the many ways in which many argue that the cause of the Great Depression was World War I itself, that the global economy never really recovered from the ravages and deprivations that World War I wrought. This was Herbert Hoover's argument as he looked back on the fate of his presidency and for many years his name, his image in the United States and around the world, as he was so associated with this Great Depression. He always blamed World War I as the cause of the Great Depression, and there's an argument for that, that the debt, the physical destruction of these countries, all of those consequences of World War I were never really remedied. And the remedies that were pursued were, again, patchwork. Many of the remedies made the existing economic order worse: debt, speculation, deregulation of industries. And further evidence of the way in which World War I can be seen as a causal instrument to the Great Depression is that Great Britain, which again had the resources, it was the wealthiest country in the world, certainly the wealthiest country in Europe, a nation that had the resources to loan money out and perhaps stop some of the amplification and deepening of this crisis, failed to do so because they were so concerned about the lingering debt Great Britain had accumulated in World War I. So what could have been a bulwark against the Great Depression and its deepening was not there, not available because of, again, Great Britain's unwillingness to extend credit. Great Britain and France continued to demand that Germany live up to the Versailles Treaty. Here's another way in which we can see the seeds of the Great Depression, certainly its magnification and deepening in World War I. As we learned in our recent lectures on World War I, at the end of World War I, Germany was forced to accept 100% responsibility for the war, and with it came reparations, payments it had to make to Great Britain and France, the nations that were declared the winners of World War I. Well, even as the Great Depression stung an already reeling German economy. I mean, poor Germany, never even got to enjoy those brief moments of prosperity that we talked about in the 1920s, because the 1920s was a terrible time for Germany as it suffered through the aftermath of World War I. Not only the loss of its colonies and the blow to its national prestige and pride, but massive inflation, massive unemployment. And on top of that, they had to continue to pay reparations to Great Britain and France. And this is very important in, again, the way in which we can see how the end of World War I leads to World War II. You do have that blow to the German psyche, the German national pride, a nation that, like so many around the world, were deeply committed to that sense of being part of a nation, a great, glorious nation. The decline of their prestige and power around the world, with the way in which the Versailles Treaty forced Germany to surrender its colonies and cut back its army and navy. But on top of that, you have the economic deprivations and woes that Germany experienced in the 1920s, even before the global economy is dragged into this depression. And then there's this sting, there's this constant reminder of World War I in the payments that Germany has to dole out to Great Britain and France that it can't use to invest in its own country. And that again helps explain why a failed art student with one testicle and a short mustache will be very appealing to the German people when he comes along and says, I will restore the glory and might of the German people. I will avenge the ongoing injustice of the Versailles Treaty. The Versailles Treaty was not just an insult meted out in Paris in 1919. It continued to insult and abuse the German people through this payment of reparations, while the German economy itself was staring into its own abyss. And so when Hitler comes along and says, I'll end all this, I'll put people to work, I'll restore the might and glory of the German nation, well, that's very appealing. And more about that coming as well as we continue our look at the interwar period at this point in the class. Many nations stung by the Great Depression, many of these industrial nations, responded with high tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. They have been used throughout human history to protect domestic production, domestic manufacturing from foreign competition. A tariff is a tax on an imported good. Tariffs have been used in the United States for many decades. Used to be if you wanted to buy a Toyota or Honda, it would cost a lot more because the government of the United States put a tariff on foreign cars, because the government of the United States was trying to get you to buy a Ford or a Chevy, a car or truck produced here. So that's an example of how tariffs can work to protect domestic made goods from foreign competition. They are an instrument used by governments throughout the industrial history of the global economy to that end, to protect locally made goods from foreign competition. The government of the United States doesn't want you to buy a Toyota Honda. They want you to buy a Ford or Chevy, so they make Hondas and Toyotas cost more. Well, the solution, by the way, to that for Honda and Toyota was just to make their cars here. If you drive a Honda or Toyota, chances are it was either made in Tennessee or Alabama, where they moved their production plants to get away from these tariffs. So in many ways, tariffs don't work out, or they have these unintended consequences. But here, the unintended consequences of tariffs was to decline global commerce and global trade, to create a rivalry, a competition of protectionism between the different industrial nations that, again, prohibited them from working together, increasing capital outflows, and trying to restart and restabilize a global economy. Instead, they retrenched. They looked out for their own national economies. They put up tariffs, import duties, limits on the number of imports. And what this did was it really further calcified the global economy by limiting international trade, declining production. So you had this very provincial response that led to this protectionism, the increase in tariffs, the import duties, which limited imports. Each nation thought this will be great. Our own economies will revive, and they failed to notice what they should have noticed with the onset of this Great Depression, that the global economy is deeply intertwined, and what's good for the other guy is often good for you too. That's not what prevailed. Instead, this very protectionist approach that ultimately made things worse. All right, so we've talked about the global depression, the Great Depression in the United States and in industrialized Europe. Let's now talk about the effects, the impact of this global depression on the colonized world, the areas of the world that, as we described in an early lecture, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, had been colonized by these industrial powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany. Let's talk about the impact of the Depression there. And it's further evidence of the pernicious impact of colonialism, the pernicious impact of imperialism. Imperialism is inherently pernicious because it denies to the people of Latin America, Africa, Asia self-determination. Colonialism was predicated on this idea that those people don't get to govern themselves, that we, the British, the French, the Americans, the Germans, the Dutch, the Japanese, can control those parts of the world. And they're invaded and colonized by these industrial powers as they seek access to markets, access to raw materials. So colonialism is inherently pernicious. It's also inherently pernicious because it's predicated by racism, social Darwinism, this belief that the people of Africa, Asia, Latin America don't deserve to govern themselves because they're inherently inferior. And as we'll talk about later in the class, one of the terrible effects of colonialism was introducing ideas of racial hierarchy from the European mindset to these colonized reaches of the world. And later that will have key consequence as these hierarchies are perpetuated in the post-colonial era as we examine decolonization later. So colonialism and imperialism are inherently pernicious. They deny people of color self-determination. They advance, deepen, and expand ideologies of racism. But here in the Great Depression, you could see some other pernicious effects of colonialism in the way in which, now tied to these industrial nations, as these parts of the world, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, are colonized, how their economies will be ravaged and destroyed by the Great Depression. With Africa, Asia, and Latin America now folded into the industrial age through this colonial asymmetry, this asymmetrical control that is imposed upon colonized parts of the world by industrial nations, now this part of the world, the developing world, the colonized world, is connected to that larger global economy that has made its way into this abyss, that has fallen into this massive cataclysmic depression. What happens is the economies of Africa, Asia, Latin America, folded into this global order, are dragged into this economic misery. They were to complement these industrial powers through the production of agricultural products, mineral products that were often utilized in the industrial process. Remember, one of the major driving forces of imperialism was access to things like oil, rubber, diamonds, a variety of resources that were extracted from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and sent to the industrial world to aggrandize the wealth and power of industrialists. Are you starting to see the pernicious and terrible effects of colonialism? They are manifold, right? And so the economies of the colonized parts of the world, developing world, were now predicated on satisfying the demand for agricultural products to feed industrial workers in industrialized parts of the world, to provide certain raw materials, minerals, and other resources to fuel the factories in Europe and the United States. But now there's no demand for those industrial products. There's little interest in importing these products from the colonized world, as you have this global decline in production, a decline in demand. That global economy has come to a screeching halt. And so there's this glut of foodstuffs and other raw materials, products produced in the colonized world, and no market for them. And so Europe, the United States, they march around the globe, they fight wars of aggression, they colonize Africa, Asia, Latin America, they deny those people freedom, self-determination, they justify it through racism and social Darwinism, and then they fold these parts of the world into their industrial economy. Well, then their industrial economy collapses, and that does great damage to the economies of Africa, Asia, Latin America. They were dedicated now to producing the things that Europeans and Americans demanded. They were dedicated to producing the variety of products necessary to fueling that industrial economy, but now that industrial economy is no more. And so there's no demand for these export products. And as a result, the economic woe, misery, and deprivation makes its way to the developing world. You had, in places like Brazil, the deliberate destruction of these crops because there's no demand for them. In Brazil, they're burning coffee crops because the industrial world isn't importing coffee. There's this steep decline in demand for coffee. Nobody has money to purchase these products. Nobody has the money to buy large amounts of coffee when they're living in a Hooverville standing in a bread line. And to me, this is the real tragedy of the Great Depression here. They're burning coffee. They're wasting coffee, right? You know, this probably at this point in the class is not much of a revelation. Every day when I wake up, I immediately start doing drugs. After a few lectures, after a few weeks, you've probably already concluded that guy's got to be on something, right? But thankfully for me, my drug of choice is a legal one, caffeine. And so I am indeed a slave to the coffee bean. And so it's particularly traumatizing for me to teach this portion of the lecture where they are deliberately destroying coffee. And they're doing so because Brazil's economy was now centered on satisfying the demand for coffee in the industrialized world. But when that demand dries up, that means there's no way to turn that coffee into profit. And so you destroy it and create an artificial scarcity. So this really exposes again how these parts of the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, are deeply intertwined with the global industrial order thanks to colonialism. And it also demonstrates this, again, pernicious effect of colonialism because now those local economies that have been perverted, distorted, destroyed by this foreign intervention through colonialism, now these local economies that have been perverted in this way are also ravaged by the Great Depression. Rather than self-sustaining economies created by people in these parts of the world that are a reflection of local priorities, the priorities in these parts of the world have now become satisfying the demand in America, in the United States, and in Europe. But when that demand declines, well, the terrible effects fall back upon the people of Africa, Asia, Latin America. There's no demand for these products that had once been exported to the industrial world. And again, you see these terrible effects like ripples in a pond reaching far and wide. A decline in demand leads to a decline in employment, which leads to a decline in demand. And now these parts of the world are also stung deeply by the Great Depression. I've mentioned throughout this slide that these desperate and terrible fortunes, fates for the people of Africa, Asia, and Latin America are yet another consequence of colonialism, imperialism. Colonialism and imperialism dragged these economies into the global industrial order, and then when the global industrial order collapses, well, people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are now feeling the misery and woe. In the second half of the 20th century, in the second half of this class, we'll see the decline of imperialism, formal colonialism and imperialism in these parts of the world, and a wave of decolonization sweep through Africa, Asia, Latin America, where people in that part of the world, often only after long, bitter struggles against colonial powers, are able to finally win independence. And you have newly independent nations emerging in Africa, Asia, Latin America. Finally, we can govern ourselves. But the legacies of colonialism endure in a variety of ways. Again, we'll talk a lot about how what was grafted onto these local societies, things like racial and social hierarchies, endure after the French, British, Germans, and Dutch leave, but also the consequences of industrialization linger on. And Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, they had experienced the ill effects of industrialization. They saw how the introduction of this system led to misery, woe, and deprivation, and as a result, there'll be a lot of circumspection about industrialization as the way forward. When we examine decolonization later in the class, we'll see debates within these nations, what path to follow. It's that old theme, right, that keeps coming back over and over again, because that's what themes do over and over again. What's the way forward? What's progress? Should we follow the model of Europe, the United States, industrialize? Is that the way forward? The United States will argue that in the context of decolonization and the Cold War. Follow us. We know the way. Industrialize. Capitalism will make you free. Capitalism will make you prosperous. But people in Africa, Asia, Latin America, they remember what capitalism brought to their nation during this moment, the Great Depression. Capitalism is culpable for all of this misery and despair. And as a result, many decolonized nations will try to pursue a different path. They will try to pursue a different order that in a now independent state will offer an alternative to the industrial capitalist model that had produced such misery and despair in the colonial period. So not only does this allow us to think about that enduring argument, that enduring theme in the class of how best to prosper, what's the way forward, but it also indicates how when we talk later about the legacies of colonialism, when we talk about decolonization in Africa, Asia, Latin America, we will be very mindful of the consequences of that first half of the 20th century when many of these systems were imposed upon the people of the developing world. So having discussed the Great Depression, a global depression rippling through now the totality of the globe, United States, Europe, and the colonized world, let's talk about the response or responses to the Great Depression. How do these nations respond? Well, in certain parts of Europe, it led to an embrace of socialism, stemming from a critique of liberalism and industrial capitalism. Many, in particularly Northern Europe, came to the conclusion that this hope for humanity, this pathway forward, this ideology of progress, liberalism had failed, that it led to this destructive moment. And we need to pursue a different path. That the arguments that capitalism and industrialization inevitably create haves and have-nots has some currency. And what we need to instead do is create an economic order that works for everyone. And so in many parts of Europe, socialism is on the rise in the 1930s. As the argument prevails in certain segments of European societies and certain nations that the Great Depression is the ultimate example of the destructive elements of capitalism, that capitalism is in many ways bound to create moments of catastrophe. And the solution is to pursue a different path. Now, this transition to a more socialist economy in certain parts of Europe is a complicated one of fits and starts. This is a class where we attempt to cover over 100 years of human history in 10 weeks. So we tend to speak in broad strokes. The idea here is to introduce you to the history of the 20th century rather than offer you a comprehensive and complete study of that history. So in a class like this, we talk about isms and ideologies a lot. And it's important to note that socialism isn't a monolith. It isn't a group of people who all get along and agree. And there are a lot of schisms and divisions within socialist movements, particularly in Northern Europe, where they argued about what's the best way to go forward. That question, should we model ourselves after the Russian Revolution? Rise up in armed rebellion, seize the assets, execute the ruling class? Or should we work through the existing system and reform our political structure and economy to achieve what ultimately socialism seeks, a more equitable sharing of the wealth? Socialism arrived as that compromise. It was a way of achieving what Marx and others hoped to materialize, again, a more equitable sharing of prosperity and wealth without bloody revolution, without a protracted struggle like you saw in Russia that would lead to the death of millions of people. Socialism provided a political, social answer to the ravages of the Great Depression that did not necessitate armed revolution. And so in certain parts of Europe, in particularly Northern and Western Europe, in the 1930s, a political movement develops, a socialist political movement, not a communist revolutionary movement, that sought to preserve certain elements of capitalism, industrialization. After all, capitalism does produce all kinds of wonderful things like automobiles and radios and other gadgets and gizmos that make life good, but also capitalism tends to produce things like global depressions and great disparities in wealth and a political system that seems to be captive to a small ruling elite. So wouldn't it be great to continue mass production of consumer goods, but also intervene in a way that produces economic stabilization and security? Socialism in Scandinavian countries like Norway, in areas of Northern Europe, became that solution, a political solution that, again, obviated the need for armed revolution, that achieved transition and change while preserving elements of a capitalist order, but also ensuring economic security and stability. The lesson of the Great Depression for many parts of Europe was we need to create order, stability. This is a product of volatility, uncertainty. What we need to do is create security for our citizens, the group of us who are members of this community and nation. That might mean education, healthcare. It might mean guaranteed employment or rights to unionize and seek out protections through union membership. And that led to the origins of more socialist political structures and societies in Scandinavian countries of Northern Europe or Western Europe. So we've talked about the Russian Revolution. We talked about it as a revolution. In this lecture, we talked about the response to that, a fear of, again, a seizing of elites and bloodshed and violence. Socialism sought to achieve a more stable economic order, a system that folded in opportunity and prosperity for all without violent revolution. However, in the 1930s, that model remained largely provincial, limited to Northern Europe, because in Great Britain and France, there was a reticence to embrace socialism in this way. The existing ruling power feared socialism as, again, a seed, a germ, a beginning point for eventual communist revolution. And so the Conservative Party that ruled Great Britain in the 1920s, as part of that conservative turn in many industrial nations, lost credibility and power, and the Labour Party took over in the 1930s, a more liberal and the more contemporary mindset reformist party that was more willing to use government action and support to stabilize the economy. They took power after 1929, but they don't embrace socialism. They don't embrace many of the pathways that were adopted in Scandinavian countries and other parts of Europe, because they were fearful that it could be the seedbed, the origins of a communist takeover. So you don't see socialism really develop in Great Britain in the 1930s because of this very cautionary approach by the ruling party, who fears a more radical turn and also fears reprisal, that they may be associated with such radicalism and that might lead to the return of the Tory party, the conservative movement. France, you see greater achievement, greater advances by socialism because they were more comfortable with that radical reform agenda. And so France, a little bit more along the model that we see in Scandinavian countries, with greater economic stabilization and security. But again, socialism, not a monolith. There were grave concerns that this was a measure that would not produce true change, that would reestablish or reify the existing ruling class. And so there's a lot of fractures and divisions in France about such movements and whether or not they are, again, stymieing and limiting the revolution that must go forward. It's really about true believers. It's about ideology. It's about whether or not you are an adherent to that linear progression that Marx outlined, that this is inevitable. And if it's inevitable, why would you compromise? Why would you postpone? Why would you take half measures? There were true believers in France that, again, what happened in Russia is inevitable to happen here, and the Great Depression is the moment to set that in motion. It's a great cataclysm, great event. But there are other members of the left, of reformist movements in France, that feared revolution, feared the consequences of a revolution spiraling out of control. And in France, such concerns, well, they have a very deep-rooted place within French history, because the French Revolution did spiral out of control in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and it wasn't good for the French nation, not only in the revolution, but in its aftermath, the rise of a despot who took over. So France, though it does have a more radical tradition, it was the nation that was transformed by a liberal revolution in the late 1700s. It was also a nation that was very reticent to embrace radical ideologies and very cautious about the potential of revolutions to spiral out of control and have unintended consequences. So that too accounts for the lack of a true socialist state emerging in France. In Great Britain, it's because the Labour Party didn't want to be associated with radicalism. In France, it's because socialists often disagreed. Revolution onward, or wait a minute, revolutions are scary. And we remember the rise of Napoleon and the time of troubles and terror in the French Revolution of the late 18th century. And so it's a very incomplete, fits and starts, fractured story of socialism in France. So the Great Depression in Scandinavian countries and Northern Europe led through a political adoption of socialism. It led to incomplete changes in Great Britain and France, often as a product of fear of radical change and socialism. In the United States, the response to the Great Depression was very different. It came in the form of the New Deal, which was the vision of reform and change, the vision of remedying the effects of the Great Depression that came from the newly elected president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. 1932, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president of the United States, and he represented change on a number of levels. He was a Democrat, and the country had been governed by Republicans since our old friend Warren G. Harding. In the 1920s, you had a string of Republican presidents, but then the Great Depression hits, and the country blames Herbert Hoover, and that led to an opportunity for the Democrats to reclaim the White House, which they did with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932, but much more substantively, he represented change in his willingness to use the government to intervene in ways that would respond to the immediate crisis of the Great Depression, put people to work, shore up a flagging economy, but also use the government in a way to restore faith in the American system of capitalism through a safety net, a minimum economic security that Roosevelt believed no one should fall below. He saw this moment of crisis as a chance to create such a system that offered a true vision of freedom for Americans predicated on economic security. For Roosevelt, freedom meant more than just free expression, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. He argued that freedom comes first and foremost from economic security. If you don't have a job, if you're living in a cardboard box on University Avenue in Riverside, California, you have freedom of speech. You could say whatever you want. You have freedom of religion. You have the freedom to believe or not believe whatever religious orthodoxy or doctrine you choose. But if you're living in a cardboard box, I don't feel very free. Freedom means more than just free expression or individual will. For Roosevelt and his New Deal, freedom first and foremost comes from economic security, a job, a belief that you could find work and be able to support yourself and your family. And so all of this led to his program of Reform the New Deal, which put people to work in jobs programs like the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, Civilian Conservation Corps. Both of these were founded here in the United States in the 1930s as federal jobs programs. This meant that now the federal government was the direct employer of millions of people. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, employed 3 million people. The CCC employed another 3 million people. So cumulatively, these two jobs programs employed over 6 million Americans. The economic logic here was if you could not find a job in the private sector because GM, GE, Hughes Aircraft, they're not hiring, their factories are closed, you could instead find a job working for the government. Now, these weren't permanent jobs. These were temporary jobs. And they were designed to restabilize and revitalize the consumer capitalist economy. The logic here also involved, well, if we pay these people, they will have money to spend. And that money will go right back into the economy and revive consumer demand. So that element of the New Deal, these jobs programs, again, not designed to promote radical change, but really to restore the capitalist consumer economy by putting people to work, putting money in their pockets, money they will spend. And the jobs that these people performed were also dedicated to revitalizing the consumer capitalist economy in the United States. What did the WPA and CCC do? Well, they built roads, 500,000 miles of roads, 600 airports. They built schools and universities. They built sewage treatment plants, water treatment plants. They built hydroelectric dams that allowed for urban growth, that allowed for folding into the industrial consumer economy, rural parts of the country. The Tennessee Valley Authority, an offshoot of the CCC, built hydroelectric dams, strung electric wires in the rural South, and that allowed people in parts of the United States that did not have electricity in the 1930s to again engage in the modern era. So in so many ways, these jobs programs were a way of revitalizing the American economy, staving off radical change. By putting people to work, putting money in their pockets, revitalizing a consumer economy, and building an infrastructure, roads, airports, dams, that again could serve as the lifeblood for a revitalization of a consumer capitalist economy. Another element of the New Deal was the Social Security system. Here's a good example of how the New Deal affects all of you. If you are employed, as I imagine most of you are, the payroll tax that's taken out of your check is there to fund this program, Social Security, which was created for the first time in 1935. It was designed to help people who could not work owing to old age or disability to still have an income. It's reflective of that New Deal ethos of economic security for all, a safety net no one should fall below, but it's also reflective of the way in which the New Deal was about revitalizing a consumer capitalist economy, because Social Security is first and foremost a consumer program. It's designed to put money into the pockets of people who wouldn't have access to the consumer economy. It's designed to put money into the pockets of people so they could spend it. Elderly people who can't work, well, they don't have money to spend. Social Security. Disabled people who can't work, well, Social Security puts money into their pockets. So the best way to understand Social Security is as a consumer program. It's designed to allow everyone to be consumers, including the elderly, including those who cannot physically work. So Social Security is another example of the American response to the New Deal, the revitalization of a consumer capitalist economy. And by the late 30s, there were certain segments of the American economy that were back to pre-Depression levels. Urban areas thrived as a result of the New Deal. A lot of money poured into New York City and Chicago. They were often the epicenters of a lot of these public works projects. Rural parts of the United States continue to lag behind because in the 1930s here in the United States, simultaneously there were two disasters. There was the economic disaster of the Great Depression, but also an ecological disaster, the Dust Bowl drought, which really ravaged farm communities. Also, benefits for the New Deal were not equal in terms of race and gender. Women were often excluded from New Deal programs that were predicated on the male breadwinner ideal of an American household, putting men back to work. And many New Deal programs, like Social Security, excluded African Americans and other racial minorities. They were left out of many of these programs. So the New Deal helped to revitalize certain segments of the American economy and segments of the American society, but it was not an equally felt economic revitalization. But ultimately, it was dedicated to this process of restoring faith in the American system in capitalism. In the 1930s here in the United States, many radical movements gained steam. The socialist and communist movements gained steam because they offered themselves as alternatives to a capitalist order that had led to such misery and deprivation. But also in the 1930s, there were many movements sympathetic to fascism. There was the America First movement in the 1930s, led by Charles Lindbergh. In the 1930s, the former aviator, Charles Lindbergh, entered politics and became a great rival to FDR. If you've watched the HBO series, A Plot Against America, it's a counterfactual, it's historical fiction that plays with the idea of whether or not Charles Lindbergh, if he had run for president in 1940 against FDR, whether or not he would have prevailed and how much American history and world history would have been very, very different. Charles Lindbergh, the aviator in the 1930s, was now the leader of a movement called America First. Where have we heard that more recently? Lindbergh was very sympathetic to Adolf Hitler, and so he argued for isolationism. America first. We don't need to be involved with foreign affairs. We don't need to worry about the rise of Hitler and fascism in Europe. America first. Let's stay isolated. Let's not confront Adolf Hitler. And part of the reason why Lindbergh made that argument was that he shared a lot of beliefs, including anti-Semitism, with Adolf Hitler. Henry Ford, the American industrialist, was also an admirer of Adolf Hitler. And if you do a little Google search, it's not too hard to find photographs of Henry Ford getting little prizes and medals from members of the Third Reich, the Nazi regime. And Henry Ford had many slave labor factories in Germany producing Ford automobiles. There were demagogues here in the United States like Huey Long and Father Coughlin, who were very critical of the New Deal and often fanned the flames of populist movements. So the 1930s was a time in which the United States stared into the abyss, and many concluded that we've lost our way, capitalism has failed, and that created a seedbed, a foundation for radical ideologies to develop. But the New Deal was designed to counter that by putting people to work, by offering them economic security and stability, by encouraging people to buy homes through low interest, low down payment loans from the Federal Housing Administration, through Social Security and jobs programs that put money in people's pockets. The hope was to restore faith in the American system and stave off socialism, communism, and fascism. America experienced the ravages and woes of the Great Depression. And in the United States in the 1930s, there were Americans, prominent Americans, who advanced this argument that capitalism has failed. But at the end of the Great Depression, America doesn't go fascist. America doesn't go communist. You do not have a bloody revolution in the United States in the 1930s, and that's due to the New Deal, where FDR comes in, uses the government in a way that, again, was designed to restore hope and confidence in the American system, capitalism revitalized and preserved. One of the very persistent questions in American historiography, again, when dorky historians get together and argue, is this question of why did the United States not go towards a more socialist approach, a socialist model that eventually germinates and develops in Europe? And you hear this argument a lot today. Why don't we have a national healthcare system? They have it in Great Britain. They have it in these other nations, industrial nations in Europe. Why don't we have a cradle-to-grave system that provides healthcare, education, various forms of economic assistance? Well, the answer to that can be seen in this lecture. We began with the effort in the 1920s and the more reactionary conservative period to combat radicalism, socialism, that fear that it could happen here, and that led to the Palmer raids and repression. But also in the 1930s, through the New Deal, FDR, as part of his New Deal, sought to incorporate labor unions and other potential hotbeds of radicalism into the existing order. Usually in times of economic decline, labor unions get weaker. Not the case in the Great Depression. FDR and his Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, worked hard to shore up labor unions, to legitimize them, to clean up some of their reputation associated as hotbeds of radicalism, and integrate them into the American system, to integrate them into that capitalist consumer economy that the New Deal sought to bolster. So socialism doesn't prevail in the United States like it will in Western Europe, other parts of the world that were industrialized and hit hard by the economic deprivations of World War I, Great Depression, and then later, as we'll talk about, the aftermath of World War II, because of the association of labor unions and certain socialist movements with radicals and the efforts we talked about earlier in the class to repress those movements, to drive them underground, to discredit them, but also because of the New Deal, which offered itself as a different path, one that embraced labor unions and folded them into the system, keeping them close to centers of power, close to the U.S. government as partners rather than antagonists. But also there's race and religious differences that prevented solidarity and unanimity among working class people who could unite as have-nots. That source of division so prominent in American history and the American present, where people are often pitted against each other because of race and religion, also causal and important here in differentiating the United States from parts of Europe that we've examined in this lecture. Many historians of the United States argue that in the history of the United States, race trumps class, meaning that when people form identity, they think first and foremost about race, and secondarily or tertiarily or whatever, much farther in the background of their psyche, think about class. So that poor people don't see themselves united as the poor people pitted against the wealthy. Instead, they first and foremost think of their identity in relation to race. And that means it's hard for you to create a multiracial, multi-ethnic movement centered on the interests of the poor, the working class, workers. In the United States, industrialists, politicians have often been very skillful at pitting poor whites against racial minorities. Whiteness as a source of identity primary in a way that precludes the potential solidarity of working people across racial lines. And so race and racism, a key factor here as well, but also, again, the New Deal and the way in which it sought to remedy the system rather than overthrow the system. So this is one of the arguments in U.S. history and world history. Why do we see in Europe socialism develop and it doesn't develop here in the United States? Well, there's a number of factors, many of which we've already introduced. Later in the class, we'll talk about that second Red Scare, the Cold War, which is also key here. But at this point, as we examine the Great Depression and these different pathways embraced by different European nations, the United States, we have a number of answers here to that persistent question of why no socialism in the United States. On the right here, you have another factor, propaganda, which quite often and through today tends to represent socialism as this bleak, miserable experience where nobody has a job, nobody has any material comforts, and that too has played a role. Let's summarize what we've learned here about the Great Depression and the different ways of organizing society now through the 1930s. Soviet Union's a communist state. The United States reclaims its commitment to capitalism and consumerism through the New Deal. Socialism starts to germinate and develop in certain parts of Europe, but is limited in its impact, particularly in the most industrialized and wealthy parts of Europe, where there's reticence to such radical transformations, namely France and Great Britain. And then, of course, there are people who we've also described in this lecture who don't get a chance to decide the pathway forward. Africa, Asia, Latin America, they're denied sovereignty, they're denied independence, they're denied a chance to govern themselves. They remain through their colonial status tied to these industrial nations. And so that's a key point to make as well, that in the latter slides of this lecture we stress, well, what do you do when the economy collapses? Well, that's predicated on the idea that you have the power to make such decisions. If you're not a separate sovereign nation, if you are not an independent nation, if you are a colony, well, you're denied, again, that self-determination. And as I've alluded to, we'll have to see until after World War II and independence and decolonization finally taking root in that part of the world to see how these nations respond to the experiences with industrialization and capitalism that they have felt. However, there is one system that we haven't talked about that's also developing in the 1930s. There's socialism, there's the New Deal, there's the Soviet Union as a communist alternative to those other pathways. In Germany in the 1930s, another system is developing in the context of so much of what we've talked about, fascism. And that will be our focus in our next lecture as we continue our look at the interwar period.